I want to start today with a bit of a thought experiment. I want you to picture the map of the Middle East,
Okay.
but not the political map we see on the news, with all the straight lines drawn by Sykes and Picot. I mean the map of the 7th century.
Right. The dawn of Islam,
Yeah.
the era of the great empire.
Exactly. When you picture that, when you close your eyes and imagine that world, where does your mind's eye focus?
Well, I think for most of us, for anyone who's had a basic history class or, even just seen a movie about that period, you're picturing the deep desert.
The Hijaz.
The Hijaz, yeah. You see camels, these endless sand dunes, maybe some tribal isolation.
Yeah.
The whole story of late antiquity often feels like it's happening on the absolute periphery of the known world, almost disconnected from the major powers.
That's it. We have this ingrained mental image that the main event of religious history, especially the rise of Islam, was happening in some kind of vacuum, far, far away from the superpowers of the day. But what if that map is wrong? Or, maybe more accurately, what if the GPS coordinates we've all been using to read history are off by, say, 1,000 kilometers?
That is the big question we are wrestling with today. And I have to be honest, the research we are diving into is, well, it's heavy. It's incredibly controversial.
To put it mildly.
It forces you to just completely recalibrate your entire mental model of that region and that time.
It certainly does. We're looking at a collection of lectures, detailed essays, and video presentations from a researcher named Dr. Khaled Waleed.
Right.
He runs a platform called Almighty Covenant in Arabic. It's Mithaq al-Khaliq. And his work isn't just a slight adjustment to a timeline or some small historical footnote. He's proposing a radical, ground-up re-examination of where the events of the Quran actually took place.
Yeah, this isn't history in the traditional sense of just looking at text. This is a synthesis.
Yeah.
Dr. Waleed calls his methodology the thought of Khaled and the pen of Waleed.
What does that mean exactly?
Right. It means he's combining things that you don't normally see together.
Yeah.
He's taking modern satellite topography like literal elevation data from NASA, and he's meshing it with ancient linguistic roots and a very, very granular timeline of the Byzantine-Sassanid Wars.
And all of that is to argue that we've been looking at the wrong stage for, 1,400 years?
1,400 years. He's arguing that the sacred center, the true focal point of the Quranic narrative, isn't where tradition places it in the southern desert of Arabia.
It's in the north.
It's in the north. Specifically, he's triangulating what you might call a sacred radius that connects Jerusalem, the Dead Sea, and the Jordan Valley.
And this isn't based on a hunch. He's not just saying it feels right. He's basing it on what he calls a scientific miracle that he believes is hidden in the text itself.
Right.
Something involving elevation data that nobody, absolutely nobody in the 7th century could have possibly known.
And that's the hook that really pulls you in, this concept of Edna al-Ard.
The lowest land.
The lowest land.
So buckle up, because today we aren't just reading scripture. We're reading altimeters. We are going to walk through the near collapse on the Roman Empire, the rise of a new theology, and the literal physics of the Dead Sea Rift.
That's a lot to unpack. We definitely need to take it piece by piece.
Absolutely. So let's start with the context. Because to really understand why Dr. Waleed's theory about geography is so explosive, we first have to understand the geopolitics of one specific year, 614 AD. It sounds like a random date, but according to this research, it's the pivot point of all of history.
Yeah, 614 AD is the moment the world broke.
Okay.
You really have to understand, in the early 7th century, the world was fundamentally bipolar. You had two superpowers, and they had effectively split the known world between them.
Like the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
A pretty good analogy, actually. On one side, you had the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Romans, or Rum, as they're known in all the Eastern sources. They were Christian, monotheistic, and they saw themselves as the rightful inheritors of civilization.
And on the other side, who are they fighting?
The Sassanid Empire, the Persians. And they were Zoroastrian. Now, to the Romans and to the other early monotheists in the region, these were, well, they were pagans.
They called them fire worshippers.
That was the polemical view, yeah. They worshipped fire. They represented this dualistic worldview, light versus dark, that was just fundamentally at odds with the one God concept of the Christians and the emerging group of believers that would become Muslims.
So this was the Cold War of late antiquity, a clash of ideologies.
It was, but in 614, it turned incredibly devastatingly hot. The Persians, led by this brilliant general named Sharbaraz, launched an invasion into Levant that wasn't just a border skirmish.
This was different.
This was a war of annihilation, and they had a very specific target in mind.
Jerusalem.
the spiritual heart of the Roman Empire. And Dr. Waleed, in his research, really emphasizes the sheer brutality of this event. This was not a peaceful handover of keys or some diplomatic treaty. This was a bloody 21-day siege.
And a siege in that era means starvation, bombardment, utter panic inside the walls.
All of that. And when the walls were finally breached in July of 614, it was a massacre. The historical sources that Dr. Waleed pulls from describe tens of thousands of people killed. Churches were burned to the ground.
Including the most important one.
Including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which marks the very site of the crucifixion and burial of Jesus. But the real blow, the thing that sent a psychological shockwave from Constantinople all the way down to the Arab tribes, was the looting.
They took the relics.
They took the relic, the true cross,
Yeah.
the actual physical piece of wood that Christians believed Christ was crucified on. The Persians took it, packaged it up, and carried it back to their capital, Ctesiphon, as a war trophy.
I just want to pause on that for a second, because for a modern listener, you hear that and you think, okay, they captured a flag or they stole a museum artifact. It's a symbolic loss. But Dr. Waleed argues this was seen as an existential crisis, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's an understatement. You have to get into the mindset of a 7th century believer. The cross wasn't just a piece of wood. It wasn't just a symbol. It was seen as the physical guarantee of divine protection.
It was their Ark of the Covenant.
It was their Ark of the Covenant. And if the pagans could just march into the holy city, burn the most sacred church to the ground, and steal the cross, I mean, it meant God had left the building.
It meant the Romans were finished, that God had abandoned them.
It felt like the end of history. The believers, and Dr. Waleed is very clear, he includes the early Muslims in this category of monotheistic sympathizers. They were utterly devastated. The pagans were winning. The world was sliding into darkness.
And this is where we turn to the source text, Surah Ar-Rum, the chapter of the Romans.
Right. This is where Dr. Waleed's methodology really kicks into high gear. Because in the midst of this absolute, total Roman collapse, when literally everyone has written them off, the Quran makes a prediction.
A prediction that must have sounded, frankly, insane to the people listening to it at the time.
Completely insane.
It says they're going to win.
It says, and I'm quoting the meaning here, the Romans have been defeated in the nearest land, but they, after their defeat, will overcome in a few years.
Okay, let's dissect that verse, because this is the absolute core of Dr. Waleed's scientific miracle argument. And I want to focus on two specific parts. Let's start with the location, in the nearest land.
The Arabic phrase is adna al-ard.
Now, if I open a standard translation, it usually says the nearest land, or maybe a nearby land, which is interpreted to mean the land nearest to the Arabs in the Hijaz.
Correct. And that makes perfect sense contextually. The Levant is north of the Hijaz, so geographically it is nearby. But Dr. Waleed says, hold on, stop. Look at the root of the word adna.
What's the linguistic root there?
It comes from danawa. And yes, it absolutely implies closeness, proximity, but it also carries another equally valid meaning. Lowness, inferiority, being physically low. You can think of the word dunya, the worldly life, which is considered lower than the afterlife. It shares that root.
So Adna al-Ard could be translated as the nearest land, but it could just as accurately be translated as the lowest land.
Exactly. And Dr. Waleed's question is simple. Why would the Quran use this specific ambiguous word, adna? Why not use akrab, which only means nearest, or Sham, which just means the north? He argues it's because the text is functioning like a GPS coordinate.
Because of where the battle actually took place.
Right. We know from the historical records, Roman and Persian, that the decisive, crushing defeat of the Roman forces in 614, the event that allowed the siege of Jerusalem to even happen, took place in the Jordan Rift Valley.
Specifically in the basin of the Dead Sea.
The Dead Sea Basin. And if we look at that region on a modern topographic map,
it is the lowest point on the face of the earth.
Not one of the lowest. It is the lowest point on dry land.
Give me the numbers.
We are talking somewhere between 395 and 411 meters below sea level. It's this massive, visible geological depression. It is the deepest scar on the planet's dry land crust.
That is a stunning coincidence.
Dr. Waleed argues it's mathematically and logically impossible for it to be a coincidence. I mean, think about it. You're a person living in the 7th century. You don't have satellites. You don't have an altimeter. You can't survey the entire globe to know that this specific valley is lower than Death Valley in California or the Qatar Depression in Egypt or anywhere else on Earth.
To the naked eye, a valley is just a valley. It's low, but you can't know it's the lowest.
You have no frame of reference. So for the text to describe the site of this specific defeat as Adna al-Ard, a phrase that can mean the lowest land, at the exact geographical spot that science now confirms is the lowest land.
Dr. Waleed sees that as a kind of lock and key proof.
That's the term he uses, a lock and key proof of divine authorship. He says the Quran is describing a geographical reality that wouldn't be scientifically verified for another 1,000 years. It's a message encoded in the geology of the earth itself.
But I have to play devil's advocate here for a moment. Couldn't Adna just mean nearest? I mean, to an Arab living in Petra, or even further south in Mecca, the Dead Sea region is the nearest part of the Roman Empire. It's the border. The simple explanation still works.
It absolutely could. And for 14 centuries, that is precisely how the vast majority of scholars have read it. But Dr. Waleed's counterargument is about linguistic precision. Why the double entendre?
Why not use a clearer word?
Exactly. Why use a word that carries this hidden secondary meaning of lowest if that meaning doesn't apply? He argues that the Quran often uses words with multiple layers of meaning. One layer for the contemporary listener of the 7th century. For them, it meant nearest.
And another layer for a future listener.
A layer for the future listener with access to satellite technology. He sees it as a time capsule message.
A message waiting for the technology to catch up to it.
That's his view. He'll say, look, if the battle had happened in the Alps, calling it Adna lowest, would be scientifically false, even if it was near to some people. But it happened at the one place on Earth, the geographical singularity, where both meanings, nearest and lowest, are simultaneously and perfectly true.
Okay, so we have the location locked in, the Dead Sea Basin, the lowest land. Now let's look at the second part of that prophecy, the timeline. In a few years.
This is where the linguistics get incredibly precise again. The Arabic word used is bead. Bead-hi sinin.
Now, my Arabic is basically non-existent. What does bead strictly mean? Is it just a vague few?
No, and that's the key. In classical Arabic, bead isn't vague at all. It denotes a specific numerical range. It means a number between 3 and 9. Not 2, not 10. 3 to 9.
So it's a ticking clock. The prophecy is making a falsifiable claim. It's saying the Romans are crushed today, but they will achieve victory sometime between 3 and 9 years from now.
Correct. And you have to remember the context. In 614, the Romans weren't just losing battles. Their economy was in ruins, their capital city was under threat, their entire theology was in crisis. Betting on them to bounce back within a decade would be like betting on a sports team that just lost its entire roster to win the championship next year.
It seemed completely impossible.
Utterly impossible.
And the pagan Arabs at the time, they actually mocked the early Muslims over this, didn't they?
Oh, they did. Dr. Waleed notes that the Quraysh in Mecca, the polytheists, saw a clear parallel. Their argument was, look, the Persians are polytheists like us, and they just crushed the Roman monotheists. That proves our gods are stronger than your one god. We are going to crush you the exact same way.
So this wasn't just a casual prediction about foreign policy. This was a theological wager.
It was all or nothing. If the Romans didn't win within that 3 to 9 year window, the Quran's credibility would have been shattered in the eyes of everyone, friend and foe alike. The Muslims would have been proven catastrophically wrong.
So let's look at the timeline that Dr. Waleed constructs. Does it fit? Does the prophecy come true?
This brings us to section 2 of the analysis, the timeline of victory. And the central figure here, the hero of the story, is the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius.
Heraclius is such a fascinating character. He comes to power in a coup, right? He's a usurper.
Yes, he takes the throne in 610, just as everything is beginning to fall apart. And for the first few years of his reign, he's completely helpless. The Persians are rolling over his armies. Dr. Waleed points out that he actually considered moving the capital from Constantinople all the way to Carthage in North Africa just to escape.
He was going to abandon Europe and Asia Minor.
He was that desperate. But then, around the year 622 AD, something fundamental shifts. And Dr. Waleed flags this date, 622 AD, as absolutely crucial.
622 is the year of the Hijra.
Exactly.
The Prophet's migration from Mecca to Medina. It's year 1 of the Islamic calendar.
It is. But Dr. Waleed argues it's also year 1 of the Roman counteroffensive. He sees a direct synchronization. Just as the Prophet is establishing his political and military base in Medina, what he calls the command of the believers, Heraclius undergoes a profound spiritual transformation of his own.
How so? What changes?
He decides to stop fighting a political war and start fighting a holy war. He melts down the church treasures to pay for a new army. He rallies the troops not for the glory of the empire, but for the glory of God. He takes the field himself and launches a daring campaign deep into the heart of Persia.
Okay, let's check the clock. The defeat was in 614. The start of this turnaround is in 622. That's 8 years.
8 years. We're squarely within the bid's window of 3 to 9. 614 plus 8 years is 622. The prophecy said in Bid's years they will overcome, or Yalaban. Dr. Waleed argues that the process of overcoming the Galaba began exactly at that 8-year mark. The tide turned.
But the ultimate victory, the moment the war effectively ends, that's a bit later, isn't it?
Yes, the military climax is the Battle of Nineveh.
Nineveh, as in the ancient Assyrian city, in modern-day Iraq.
The very same. In December of 627 AD, Heraclius, who has marched his army deep into enemy territory, catches the main Persian army, led by a different general named Razad. And the Romans absolutely annihilate them. It's a crushing, decisive victory for the Byzantines.
Now, some critics might point out the timing here. 614 to 627 is 13 years. That's outside the 3 to 9 range.
But this is where the linguistic nuance of the verse is so important. The verse says, they will overcome. It's a future tense verb. The start of the overcoming, the shift in momentum where the Romans began to dominate the war, starts in 622, 8 years after the defeat. Dr. Waleed argues that the prophecy was fulfilled the moment that tide turned, as promised. The subsequent years were just the playing out of that now inevitable victory.
And it wasn't just a military victory. There was a political collapse in Persia right after.
Right. A few months later, in early 628, the Persian king Khaled II, the man who stole the cross and had been Heraclius' nemesis for decades, is overthrown and killed by his own son, Khaled II.
And Khaled immediately sues for peace.
Immediately. He agrees to give everything back, all the conquered territories, all the prisoners of war, and the true cross.
So the prophecy is fulfilled to the letter. The pagan superpower is broken. The monotheists survive.
And the Quranic verse continues. On that day, the believers will rejoice in the victory of God.
This is the part of the story that always trips people up. Why are the Muslims, the believers, rejoicing over a Christian victory?
Because conventionally we're taught that the history of Islam and Christianity is one of immediate and constant conflict. But Dr. Waleed proposes what he calls a radical reinterpretation of the alliances of this period. He argues that the early believers and the Romans of Heraclius were effectively on the same team.
A kind of monotheist coalition against the pagans?
That's a perfect way to put it. He even calls the Romans the political Ansars, the helpers of the early Islamic mission.
Now that is a loaded term. Ansar is what the people of Medina who took in the prophet and his followers are called. To apply it to the Byzantine emperor, that's a big step.
It is. But look at the geopolitics from Dr. Waleed's perspective. If Heraclius loses that war, what happens? Persia dominates the entire Middle East. Zoroastrianism, or at least a pagan-aligned imperialism, becomes the law of the land from Egypt to India.
And the nascent community of believers gets crushed.
It gets snuffed out before it can even begin. Dr. Waleed's argument is that Heraclius' victory was the essential geopolitical prerequisite for Islam to establish itself.
So in this view, God used the Romans to clear the chessboard.
That's the theory. The Romans distracted and ultimately destroyed the Sassanid threat, which created a power vacuum in the Levant and Arabia that the Muslims could then, in the subsequent decades, fill. It wasn't a clash of civilizations, it was a handover, a relay race.
That puts a completely different spin on the interactions we read about between the prophet and the Roman emperor. We know the prophet sent letters to Heraclius.
And in Dr. Waleed's view, those weren't just simple convert or die ultimatums, as they're sometimes portrayed. They were diplomatic overtures, a recognition from one monotheist leader to another who had just achieved a miraculous, divinely aided victory.
And this whole arc culminates in this incredibly powerful image of Heraclius in the year 630 AD. The war is finally over. He makes his way to Jerusalem.
Yes, the sources describe him walking into the city barefoot, like a humble pilgrim. And he is carrying the restored true cross on his own back to return it to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's the absolute peak of his life, the culmination of his holy war.
And the year 630 AD is also
the year the prophet peacefully conquers Mecca, the year of delegations when the tribes of Arabia come to pledge their allegiance.
So you have these two massive restorations of monotheism happening almost simultaneously. Heraclius restoring the cross to Jerusalem, and the prophet cleansing the Kaaba in the sanctuary.
And this brings us right to the door of the most controversial, the most paradigm-shifting part of Dr. Khaled Waleed's entire research project. We just said the prophet in the sanctuary. And we automatically, without even thinking, assume that means Mecca in the south of Arabia.
Right, the Kaaba in Mecca.
But Dr. Waleed stops us right there. He holds up a hand and asks, where is the sacred mosque? Where is the mother of towns? Where is the actual physical geography of the prophets?
He challenges the location of Mecca itself.
He challenges the deeply held belief that the city we call Mecca today, in the Hijaz, is the same place the Quran refers to as Bakka.
Okay, this is where we need to tread very carefully and really follow his evidence, because that is a monumental claim to make.
It's the whole ballgame. And he builds his case on what he calls a sacred anatomy.
Let's break that down. What does he mean by sacred anatomy?
He uses a fascinating body analogy. He says the earth is a container, like a human body. And just as a body has a center for the spirit, the ruh, and a different but connected center for the soul, the nafs, so too does the earth. He then maps these spiritual centers onto physical geography.
And he places them in and around Jerusalem.
He argues that the Quranic term, the Mosque al-Masjid, when it's mentioned with the definite article al, it's not talking about any old mosque. It's referring to a specific, fixed, known archetype, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, Beit el-Maqdis.
His argument is that if I say the White House, I don't need to specify the White House in Washington, D.C. You know which one I mean. There is only one, the White House.
Exactly. To a monotheist living in the 7th century, he argues the house, al-Beit, or the mosque, al-Masjid, could only mean one place, Jerusalem. It had been the sacred center for Abraham, for David and Solomon, for Jesus. Why, Dr. Waleed asks, would the final revelation suddenly shift that sacred center 1,000 kilometers south to a location with no prior scriptural history?
But the Quran explicitly mentions Bakka. Indeed, the first house of worship established for mankind was that at Bakka.
And Dr. Waleed argues Bakka is Jerusalem.
What's the basis for that connection?
He points to the Hebrew Bible, to the Psalms. Psalm 84 mentions pilgrims on their way to Zion to Jerusalem, passing through the valley of Bakka. The word Bakka in Hebrew is associated with weeping or with balsam trees. He argues the Quran is not inventing a new geography, but confirming the existing biblical geography. Bakka is the valley of Jerusalem.
So he believes the first house is the Temple Mount.
The site of Solomon's temple, the site of the Holy of Holies, the primordial center of worship.
Okay, then what is the city in the south? The city that we all know today as Mecca.
This is the sharpest and most challenging part of his critique. Dr. Waleed associates the southern desert city, whether it's the current Mecca or perhaps Petra, as some other revisionist historians like Dan Gibson have suggested, with the Jahim.
Hellfire! Punishment!
Or, more precisely, the place of punishment. He points out that the Quran refers to a mother of towns, an al-Qura, that was warned and whose people were unjust. He suggests that the southern location was associated with the ruins of punished nations, a place of heat and desolation, while the northern location, Jerusalem and the Levant, was the land of barakah, of blessing.
So he's completely flipping the map. He's saying the blessed land described in the Quran with gardens and springs is the Fertile Crescent and the Levant, which actually fits that description.
And the punished land is the arid, unforgiving desert of the deep south.
Wow.
And he connects all of this back to our starting point. Adna al-Ard, the lowest land. Remember the story of the prophet Lot?
Sodom and Gomorrah.
Right. The Quran says Lot's people lived in cities that were turned upside down and were rained upon with stones of baked clay. Geographically, where is that story located?
Well, traditional archaeology and biblical scholarship place it right near the Dead Sea.
Exactly. In the Adna al-Ard.
Mm-hmm.
In the lowest land, Dr. Waleed argues that the entire theater of operations for the major prophets, Abraham, Lot, Moses, Jesus, was within this sacred radius, centered on Jerusalem and extending to the Jordan Valley.
So his question becomes, why would the narrative jump 1,000 kilometers south for the final prophet, only to have him constantly reference stories and locations that happen in the north?
Precisely. He brings up a very powerful verse from Surah al-Hijr. It's talking about the ruins of Lot's people. And it says to the audience, and indeed you pass by them in the morning and at night. Then will you not use reason? You
pass by them. He's speaking directly to the Quraysh, the contemporary audience of the Quran.
Now think about the logistics of that. If you live in modern-day Mecca, 1,000 kilometers away from the Dead Sea, do you pass by the ruins of Sodom in the morning and at night?
No, of course not. It's a month-long caravan trip one way. It's a major expedition.
Exactly. You don't pass them on your daily commute. Dr. Waleed argues that for this verse to have any kind of visceral, emotional impact, look at these ruins right here. Don't you get the message? The audience must have been living local to that destruction.
He's suggesting the Quraysh themselves, the tribe of the Prophet, were based in the Levant or the Negev desert or near Petra, not deep in the Hijaz.
He calls it the Sabil Muqim, the fixed path. He believes the trade routes, the winter and summer journeys mentioned in the Quran, and the daily life of the primary audience were all centered on that interface between the desert and the sown land in the north, right on the border of the Byzantine Roman Empire.
Which would also explain why they cared so much about the Roman versus Persian War.
Yes.
If they were living on the border of the conflict, it directly affects them. It's their world. If they're 1,000 kilometers away in the sand, it's just news from a distant land.
That's it. It makes the Rome prophecy immediate, personal, and local. They were watching the war happen from their front porch.
Okay, this is a very compelling and internally consistent theory. But it raises a huge historical problem, a massive one. If the original sacred center was Jerusalem or the Levant, how on earth did we end up with Mecca? How did the entire map shift south?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question. And to answer it, Dr. Waleed takes us into the dark and confusing politics of the post-prophetic era, the Umayyad dynasty, a mysterious northern empire called the Khazars, and a concept he identifies as Gog and Magog.
We're going to get into Gog and Magog. I have to admit, that's usually where my eyes start to glaze over. People start talking about the apocalypse.
Stick with me here, because Dr. Waleed doesn't view them as, subterranean monsters or zombies. He views them as a specific political entity.
Okay, let's unpack that. Who are Gog and Magog in the Almighty Covenant research?
He identifies Yajuj and Majuj with specific corrupt factions of Bani Israel, the children of Israel, and he traces their direct influence back to that 614 AD war we started with.
The war where the Persians captured Jerusalem and stole the cross?
Right. We mentioned earlier that when the Persians laid siege to the city, they had local help. Specifically, they were assisted by a force of about 20,000 Jewish fighters, led by a messianic figure named Nehemiah bin Hushil.
So in this specific historical moment, you had certain Jewish factions allying with pagan Persians to destroy the Christian monotheists who held Jerusalem.
And Dr. Waleed argues that this specific alliance is what the Quran is referring to when it speaks of Gog and Magog swarming from every mound. He sees it as a swarming military force of corruption facade attacking the sacred center.
So the corruption isn't supernatural, it's a political betrayal. It's when monotheists turn against other monotheists to aid pagans in a fight over the holy city.
That's his interpretation. And he argues that this struggle for the sacred center of Jerusalem continued long after the prophet's death. He suggests that a great covering over of the truth occurred.
A cover-up.
Essentially, yes, a historical and geographical cover-up. He points to the rise of the Umayyad dynasty. They came to power after the first civil wars and ruled from Damascus, starting in 661 AD. But he also brings in this very mysterious player from the north, the Khazars.
The Khazars, that's the Turkic Empire up near the Caucasus Mountains, right?
Yes. Between the 7th and 10th centuries, they were a massive power, a third superpower wedged between the Byzantines and the Caliphate. And famously, at some point, the Khazar elite converted en masse to Judaism.
Which is a huge historical anomaly, a Turkic steppe empire becoming Jewish.
It is. But Dr. Waleed highlights something very specific and very strange about them: their coinage. Archaeologists have found Khazar coins from that era that have very, very strange inscription on them.
What does it say?
It reads in Arabic script, "There is no God but Allah. Moses is the messenger of God."
Whoa! Hang on. Moses is the messenger of God. It perfectly mimics the Islamic declaration of faith, the Shahada, but it swaps out Muhammad for Moses.
Exactly. It's a hybrid theology, a revisionist monotheism. Dr. Waleed uses this as hard physical evidence that there were powerful political forces, alliances between certain Judaic factions and others, that were actively trying to create alternative narratives and obscure the true Baka in Jerusalem.
But why hide Jerusalem? What would be the motive?
To shift the spiritual center of gravity. Dr. Waleed argues that the entire narrative was deliberately shifted from the Levant to the deep desert to serve political ends. Perhaps to distance the new religion from its Jewish Israelite center in Jerusalem, or conversely, to obscure the fact that the Roman victory Heraclius won was actually seen as a victory for the believers. It was messy.
And the Umayyads, who were based right there in Damascus, Syria, would have had a vested interest in controlling that narrative.
He suggests that during the chaos of the civil wars, the fitness, there was massive confusion and conflict over the direction of prayer and the location of pilgrimage. We know the Kaaba was damaged, even burned, during these wars. In this chaos, he argues, the definition shifted. The sacred center was relocated, perhaps for political expediency, to the safety of the deep desert, far from the reach of the Romans and the Khazars.
So the argument at its core is that the mainstream narrative we have today, Mecca as the center, the traditional Hajj sites, the geography, was canonized during the Umayyad and later Abbasid periods, effectively burying the original northern geography of the Prophet's time.
That is the core of the thought of Khaled. He believes we are looking at a map that was drawn by later political victors, not the map that was drawn by the Quran itself.
This definitely puts the deep dive. It forces you to just rethink the very foundation of the story. I want to circle back to the archaeology for a second in Section 5. We talked about the fixed path and Lot's people. Does Dr. Waleed mention any other specific sites?
He does. He takes a very broad, almost cosmic view of history. He'll bring up Göbekli Tepe, that incredible site in Turkey dating back to 10,000 BC.
The world's oldest known temple.
Right. And he sees this as evidence of the deep, ancient history of monotheism in the Fertile Crescent. His view is that monotheism isn't new, it's the original human state. Paganism is the deviation. But, to get more specific, he reinterprets the site of Safa and Marwa.
The two hills that pilgrims run between during the Hajj pilgrimage.
Yes. Traditionally, these are two small, unremarkable hills in Mecca. But Dr. Waleed argues that the real original Safa and Marwa are actually located in Jerusalem.
Where specifically in Jerusalem?
He connects them to the topography near the Mount of Olives and the Temple Mount. He bases this on a very close reading of the Quranic story of Mary, the mother of Jesus. The verse says she withdrew to an east place, Makan Sharkiya, to give birth.
And the Mount of Olives is east of the Temple Mount.
Precisely. He's connecting the Hajj rites directly to the Christian story, or rather to the Abrahamic story as a whole. He looks for a landscape that fits the Quranic description of Mary's isolation, the stream that miraculously ran beneath her, the palm tree she shook for dates. He argues that the geography of Jerusalem, with its springs, palms, and elevation changes, fits this description far better than the dry, barren valley of Mecca.
So it's all about fitting the text to the actual terrain. And if the traditional terrain doesn't fit the textual description, he concludes we must be looking at the wrong terrain.
Or, as he would put it, we must be looking at the wrong map. The text is the constant. He believes we're trying to force a square peg, which is the text, into a round hole, which is the geography of Mecca, when the square hole Jerusalem is sitting right there in plain sight.
So let's try to synthesize all of this. It's a lot. We have a prophecy about a specific battle taking place in the scientifically verified lowest land on Earth, the Dead Sea.
Okay.
We have a victory by the Christian Romans that is celebrated by the Muslim believers and is seen as divinely aided. We have a rereading of the Quran's geography that centers everything on Jerusalem as the mosque and Baca.
Check.
And we have a historical theory that this original focus was deliberately shifted south to the Hijaz by later political dynasties for their own reasons.
That is the complete synthesis.
Yeah.
And it all leads to his grand conclusion about the Ansars.
The helpers.
Dr. Waleed re-identifies the Rum, the Byzantines, under Emperor Heraclius, as the political Ansars, who, perhaps unwittingly, facilitated the Prophet's mission. He argues, and this is the bottom line, that the great victory of Surah Ar-Rum wasn't just some foreign news story that the early Muslims were happy to hear about.
It was more than that.
It was the geopolitical event that allowed Islam to survive and establish itself in the sacred land.
The logic being, if Heraclius had not miraculously crushed the Persians and their local allies would have dominated the entire Middle East, and the new message of strict monotheism would have been snuffed out by the Sassanid Empire.
Exactly. The Roman victory broke the back of the pagan superpower, creating the vacuum and the political opportunity for the believers to rise up and reclaim the sacred center in Jerusalem for pure monotheism.
It's a fascinating, if jarring, way to look at history. It makes the events of the 7th century feel much more interconnected and logical. It's not just meanwhile over in the desert. It's a single coherent story playing out on a global chessboard.
And that, I think, is the why for you, the listener. Dr. Waleed is asking us to stop looking at religious history in isolated boxes. He wants us to see the deep connections between the great empires, the physical geography of the planet, and the words of the text.
And that scientific miracle part, the lowest point on Earth, is the hook. It's the piece of hard data that pulls you in and forces you to consider the rest of the theory.
He views it as the lock and key. He argues that God placed that one specific verifiable detail, lowest land, in the text as a kind of time capsule. It's a fact that could only be proven in the modern age of science, which he sees as proving the text's divine authorship. But, and this is the crucial part, it only works if you are looking at the right map. If you think Adna just means nearest, you miss the miracle entirely. You have to look at the Dead Sea to see the sign.
That is a lot to process. It really is. But it definitely changes how you read those verses.
It does. It transforms them from what seems like a vague prediction into a precise, almost scientific geographical coordinate.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Dr. Khaled Waleed's almighty covenant theory, what's the big takeaway if you had to boil it all down?
I think the biggest takeaway is that history is often much more fluid than we think. We accept maps and timelines and narratives as being fixed and solid, but they are often just stories written by the victors of specific political struggles long ago. Dr. Waleed is challenging all of us to go back to the source text, the Quran, and the source data, the actual geography of the earth, and see if they tell a different story than the one we've inherited.
We've moved the map from the south to the north. We've turned traditional enemies, the Romans, into crucial allies. And we've turned a single battle in 614 AD into the theological turning point for the entire world.
It's a radical shift in perspective, and I think the value of his research, whether you agree with all of it or not, is that it encourages you to look for yourself. Don't just take the tradition for granted. Measure the altitude on Google Earth. Look at the ancient coins. Read the linguistic roots. Question the map.
I think I have a final thought for our listeners to mull over. If Dr. Waleed is right, and the geography of the lowest land is scientifically precise and intended as a sign, what other geographical markers in ancient texts are we misinterpreting simply because we are staring at the wrong part of the map? How many other miracles or hidden layers of meaning are sitting there in plain sight, just waiting for us to calibrate our GPS correctly?
That is the question, and I would really encourage everyone listening to do this. Open up a satellite map of the Jordan Rift Valley. Zoom in on the Dead Sea, look at the elevation data, and then read Surah Aram again with Dr. Waleed's perspective in mind, and just see if the landscape speaks to you differently now.
A huge thank you to the research of Dr. Khaled Waleed for giving us this fascinating and very challenging lens to look through today. And thank you all for listening. Keep asking questions and keep diving deep.
Until next time.
See you then.